Our next speaker is Ken's second cousin, Ben Wyatt, from the other side of the political spectrum. Ben and I studied law together 30 years ago, and since then he's carved a path in West Australian politics and was our first Aboriginal Treasurer as part of a 15-year parliamentary career. And he now sits on a number of boards. Now, he brings some pragmatism to this discussion. He has a deep and personal understanding of why governments need advice and what we've tried in the past. So I welcome Ben to give his state perspective.
Good evening, everybody. Can I particularly welcome Noel and Richie all the way from Queensland this evening. Can I thank you, Ken? As is always the way I've found, Ken has taken most of my time, but I'll endeavour to make it up with hopefully a pithy speech. State government, the reality is that state governments are the governments that have the main contact point with Aboriginal people when it comes to policy development and policy implementation. The Uluru Statement from the Heart talks about various policy failures, and they are all the purview of state governments. So why is it that state governments, all of them, in one form or another, have implemented some form of a voice? All of them. Because ultimately the challenge for governments when it comes to developing policies, who do you speak to? When I came to government as a Treasurer and Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, we had in Western Australia a well-developed native title system. In fact, the two states, Queensland and Western Australia, are really the two native title states, which gives you a capacity to speak to a recognised, credible Aboriginal group when it comes to developing policy. But ultimately, even that, when it came to broader statewide policy, needed a much larger input. And so we actually called upon a very old piece of legislation in Western Australia, the Aboriginal Affairs Planning Authority Act, Section 18 of that Act, which establishes the Aboriginal Advisory Council. This has been in existence in one form or another since 1972, and the Aboriginal Advisory Council in Section 18 of that Act specifically states there must be a council, it must be made up of Aboriginal people, and it is appointed by the Minister to advise the government of the day. Now, of course, the great weakness in that particular body is the appointment process by the Minister, and there's no other, it's up to the government of the day what that looks like. Indeed, over the years, that's ranged from, while I was Minister, representatives, male and female, from the different regions of Western Australia. Over the years, it's been pretty moribund, being an individual in government through to a proper council of advisors. But regardless of how good the people are on that, its authority always suffers from the fact that there isn't actually a broader Aboriginal input into who sits on that council and who provides the advice to government, that voice to government. I want to make this point. Even though that legislation specifically says that council will advise the government on issues in respect of Aboriginal policy, it's been in place since 1972. Not once has that section been used to challenge a decision of government. So this whole idea that the voice may well become a vehicle of litigation when its role is simply to advise, the best place to look is actually here. We've lived with this since before I was born, and at not one point has that been the case. Aboriginal people have always worn the responsibility of failure. And as you develop policy, there's no other area where there is an expectation as you develop it and you fund it and you roll it out that it is likely to fail in its delivery. That is why the Closing the Gap targets were reset in 2020 with a specific purpose to partner with Aboriginal Australia. In Western Australia, we've used that and the vehicle through the Aboriginal Advisory Council to get really good outcomes in terms of the Aboriginal procurement policy, which, but for the Aboriginal Advisory Council, would not have succeeded. And that has seen hundreds of millions of dollars in state government procurement contracts go to Aboriginal-owned businesses. That was developed in partnership with the Aboriginal Advisory Council. And perhaps a very high-profile example of where the council itself has delivered outcomes for the state is the state response to COVID. Now you may that movement of Aboriginal people back to remote communities, to places of safety away from the spreading virus was the biggest movement of Aboriginal people in Western Australia since they came off the missions and came off the stations into the missions. There is no way a state government could have done that without the express input, support, advice of the Aboriginal Advisory Council. Can you imagine? And that is why you have seen health outcomes for Aboriginal Australians, and certainly Aboriginal Western Australians, far superior to the broader community. The final point I'll leave you with, I guess, is in respect of the example that we see around the town of Roebourne. That is always, it seems, about every 3 or 4 years rolled out in the media as the example of government failure. Aboriginal people always wear the consequence of failed policy, but don't have the capacity to influence the policy development. If Aboriginal people are going to have that opportunity, if they're going to wear the responsibility, well, give us the opportunity to be involved. Give Aboriginal people the chance to simply seek advice on how policy should be developed and implemented, and you will always get, I mean, you don't need me to tell you this, but ultimately if you speak to the people on which you are trying to get a policy outcome, you always get that better outcome. And that is why I always pose that question: is anyone in this room satisfied with the outcomes that this nation has achieved over the last 40, 50 years with the amount of money we've spent in Aboriginal policy? And that is one thing I can always get a consensus on. Whether you are a committed yes voter, an undecided voter, or a committed no voter, everybody will agree with that point. So if you accept that, then you have to accept that we have to do something differently. And the best way to do that is to involve Aboriginal people. And there is no neutral position on this. You vote yes, you are voting to say we can no longer accept the failure of Aboriginal policy development and implementation in Australia. If you vote no, that is not a neutral position. You are endorsing a status quo that has failed, and you are endorsing the further misuse and bad spend of billions of dollars of taxpayers' money. For me, the choice is obvious. Thank you.